for giving me the opportunity to stand here today and to talk about the dynamic relationship that I perceive between landscape and literature in medieval Iceland. So, central to this paper is a definition of landscape that relies on the engagement of cultural agents with the world around them. Landscape is a living concept, shaped by the production and reproduction of space and place through practice and constant engagement with monuments, types of environment, and the people and things that inhabit these places. So this is a concept of landscape that draws heavily on sort of recent phenomenological approaches from archaeology, but this way of viewing past landscape is not just, I would argue, a matter for archaeologists. So one way that cultural agents engage with the world around them is by telling stories, and we've heard quite a lot about this yesterday. But I would also focus on the enshrining of these stories in written texts. And it's this aspect of landscape with which this paper engages, with the representation of landscape in narratives, and in particular, the animal-orientated landscape portrayed in certain aspects of the Icelandic Book of Settlements, or Landnámabók. So this paper will approach the idea of living landscapes through the dynamic interaction between nature and culture in this text, as embodied in the actions of animals in the narratives. And this is domestic animals that are the focus of my study. I should propose that this 13th century text, in its telling of the Viking Age settlement of Iceland, conceives this settlement, at least in part, through the formation of animal places. So, the writing of a text like the Book of Settlements is in part a recording of the landscape, but rather than recording, as a cartographer might, the specifics of the lay of the land or the contours of the shoreline, Landnámabók records the narrative contours of Iceland. It records a set of stories that are lain over the land. By telling stories about the settlement of Iceland, this text is claiming the idea of Icelandic settlement, that is, colonizing the idea of Iceland for a 13th century audience. And some scholars have suggested that by colonizing a land or area, we enculture it and we bring it into our human cultural sphere through the act of creating or recording stories. So in a similar manner, texts enculture nature. The Book of Settlements can be said to enculture the land of Iceland, just as much as the settler who claimed land to build a farmhouse or raised up walls to build a kind of enclosure around a meadow, or spread cairns over the highlands to mark a safe road in the dangerous terrain. A text is never just a text. It is a product, like the house or the wall or a cairn. A text is a part of the material culture of a certain time or place, affected by the physical circumstances of its conception, compilation or recording, as well as the ideology of its compiler. And this, I think, is important. So, as long ago as 1998, Benjamin Vail argued that it was important to acknowledge that Norse expansion and settlement in the North Atlantic was a dynamic interaction between nature and culture in order to challenge the traditional human-orientated view of Viking history. So here is suggesting that we pay more attention to ecological perspectives in history. And I would take this further and suggest that we can challenge typically anthropocentric readings of literature, not just of history, by understanding that the formulation and recording of Icelandic texts are influenced by so-called nature. So rather than just acknowledging that the settlement of Iceland was an interaction between nature and culture, we need to engage with the idea that literary texts that deal with the settlement, or settlements as many of the sagas do, are also part of this dynamic interaction that we have come to acknowledge in history. By moving beyond our human-orientated approach to reading, we can give landscape, and I would argue animals, so much deserves space in our literary analyses. So, the text known as Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements, and I apologise for my Icelandic pronunciation, exists in two redactions from the medieval period, attached to the names of Sturlufjörðsson and portrayal. Instead of the title of a single work, I tend to think of Landnámabók as an overarching title for a collection of information about the settlement of Iceland. There are different versions, and much scholarly ink has been spent trying to puzzle out the lines of transmission and influence between these different manuscripts, and I won't waste time outlining those debates here. But I think what's important to take away from this idea of this kind of complex manuscript tradition is that this was a set of stories that were not only copied, but also were changed and altered, and that was kind of an okay thing to do. So, this is a text that I perceive as open to change, as the physical, political, and religious landscape around it also changed. It is a text in interaction with the world around it. And for the meatier part of my paper, I will present a few examples of the way in which Landnámabók negotiates its world through the interaction of nature and culture. And the examples I provide are instances of what I call animal places in the text. But what do I mean when I say animal places? Well, by animal places, I mean those places which are claimed by and subsequently named after the actions of animals. I won't lie, my examples are primarily about the reproduction and death of pigs in Iceland. And those of you who are familiar with Landnámabók and a couple of the other sagas in which these episodes or similar episodes appear will be familiar with these. But these episodes of reproducing and dying are, I would argue, incredibly important to the text, or rather to the landscape, or the idea of landscape that is being recreated here. So these aren't just examples of someone, for example, someone called Thorvaldur keeping pigs in a certain area and getting really rich off them. These are examples of pigs actually doing stuff in the text. And in doing stuff, they are making places in the landscape. They are creating, in part, the landscape of the Book of Settlements. So, there are a number of places in Landnámabók that I could have chosen to talk about today, in which domestic animals are involved in the settlement of the island. Animals are often not simply perceived as food or farm labour, although this does happen, but I would argue they can be perceived as fellow colonisers of Iceland through the naming and claiming of places in this textual landscape. The naming of places that we've heard, again, quite a few things about over the last couple of days, but the naming of places does not just provide practical markers in the landscape, but establishes ideological statements of ownership or power. And anthropologists and archaeologists have acknowledged the importance animals can have in the conception of landscapes and environments. In his article, Where Eagles Dare, which some of you may have read, it's about Neolithic Orkney, Andrew Jones argued that the dwelling of animals in particular spaces can then allow them to be encompassed in the human experience of that place. A particular space may therefore conjure up the memory of animal presence, and animals can act as classifying markers, tying that animal place into more general conceptions of the landscape, and this can be then reflected in place names. So, while I'm not going to be talking about real-life, tangible place names, the place names, I believe, in the Book of Settlements still matter, but simply because the stories are there. To me, it doesn't matter whether the stories in Landnámabók are true in the sense that they can be traced to the physical places in Iceland, but what matters is that the stories have persisted. These place names exist in the text, and therefore they exist in the narrative landscape of settlement that the text constructs. And this narrative landscape of settlement is one in which 13th century Icelanders were able to place their ancestors. So, a bit more on place names in Landnámabók in general, and a distinction can be made in this text between place names that are generated by the act of observation, or that are place names that are formed by the active participation, including death, of an animal or animals in the environment. And an example, just briefly, I'll give you an example of the kind of first, more simplistic act of place naming before I go to talk about the latter in more detail. But an example of the first kind of place naming is found in the naming of Hrútafjörður, Ramfjord in Landnámabók. And Hrútafjörður is named by Ingmundur the Old and his company of migrants after seeing two rams on the other side of the fjord while they're walking around trying to find somewhere to settle. And this is a rather simplistic episode, which can be contrasted to other narratives in Landnámabók in which the naming of places after animals is an active exchange of animal, human and landscape, rather than simply described as a matter of observation. So, three such exchanges between animal, human and landscape are episodes in which pigs are abandoned or decide to go off and reproduce in a certain area of the island. And this brings me on to kind of the main discussion of this paper. To find pigs featuring so prominently in stories of settlement, to my mind, is significant. Biologically, pigs are animals that are rather handy to have around when you're settling a new land. They are fairly self-reliant and quick to reproduce. So if you want a lot of animals quickly, with minimal effort on your part, then next time you're off trying to colonise a remote North Atlantic island, be sure to take some pigs with you. But they are also highly destructive animals, and suitable as partners in a farming system that relies on undisturbed hayfields, as Viking Age farming in Iceland quickly did. And stories involving hundreds of pigs running around, as the episodes I'm going to talk about do, it's definitely a story that is suited to a settlement context, to a kind of virgin landscape, as it is. So, this is the first such episode in the Book of Settlements, and as such appears to set the linguistic formula for the at least the second episode, and it's echoed in the third episode that I'll talk about, but there are some significant differences. So in this situation, the pigs lose or kind of turn from their human owner, multiply in number, in this case by 10, and are found again after a certain period of time. And then it seems that as a result of this episode, the place name Svinadal is applied to the area, and that's kind of Pig Valley, Pig Dale. So in this episode, the productivity of these pigs and Iceland outside the boundaries of human intervention is strongly emphasised. The pigs are the subject of the verb, and are therefore the ones doing the losing or turning, actively seeking out a new area of land to colonise. The situation is one in which the successful establishment of pigs in the area is reliant on the agency of the animals rather than Steinolfa or any other kind of human intervention. In fact, Steinolfa does nothing, and we don't even know, the text doesn't really make it explicit who gives the name to the area. It's just kind of generic human action to then name the area after this event. And by giving this kind of human name to the area, because of this event, it's incorporating, in my view anyway, it's incorporating the event and the area back into a kind of human sphere, or cultural sphere of colonisation. So, the second episode of this is similar, although it has one key difference, in that it involves a named boar, whose death supplies the place name to the area as well as the kind of generic pig water and pig valley that is generated from this quote. So, as in the first quotation, the pigs lose themselves from the human sphere and are found again at a place called Svinadal. So while Svinadala and Svinavatan are plausible and common place names based on perhaps on the value of an area for keeping pigs, the naming of the area after the boar is more individualized. So here, this place is remembered and named because of the actions of this boar, who actively participates in the manner of his death in the area. That such an animal's death should be remembered, or seem plausible to the recorder of the Book of Settlements to be remembered in this way, suggests to me that this text engages with a system of relations between, on the one hand, the experience of places and events associated with animals, particularly events in which animals actively participated. So, the third episode that I'm going to talk about is quite significantly different, I think, although it does have this kind of similarities. So, this episode of Pigs Gone Wild, as it is, still has the rapid populating of a certain area by pigs outside human influence, and it has a named boar who provides a second place name to the area, or in fact, both the place names to the area. But in this episode, the initial agency of the event rests on a human figure, Helgi, who puts the pigs ashore while he sails around Iceland trying to find somewhere to build his house. So, while the pigs do establish a claim to the land through their populating of the area, and therefore do play a role in the colonisation of this part of the island, this act of colonisation is at the direction of a human settler, which stands in contrast to the two previous episodes in the text. So, just for the last couple of minutes, I will say that pigs are not the only animals associated with places and place names in this text. I could stand here for hours telling you all about them, but I feel like a lot of you would quickly want to get up and leave and go and get some tea and coffee. So, aside from the rams mentioned earlier in this paper, the book also contains references to places named after the actions of horses, cows, and sheep. So the use of animal-associated place names, or the formation of animal places in the settlement narratives of Landnámabók, cannot be considered a uniform tradition. Rather, narratives of animal places are used in various ways. However, a common motif is of the animals claiming certain spaces for themselves, which are then appropriated by the naming of the place by a human settler. And this is a motif that is common to, if not all the animal kind of episodes in the Book of Settlements. It certainly applies to quite a few of them. And this kind of brings me into thinking about spaces and about animal spaces, and this brings me back to the connection between landscape, literature and animals, which I kind of opened with at the start of this paper. Animal-human relations, in their most basic form, are about space and the ownership of space. And the literary places I have discussed today are representations of encounters in the spaces of an Icelandic landscape. And I say an Icelandic landscape because I'm not saying it's the Icelandic landscape, but it's one potential Icelandic landscape that is presented in this text. In its inclusion of the encounters between animals and the land, Landnámabók rewrites and reshapes the settlement of landscape of Iceland, visualising the north, or, and I use this quite inappropriately to mean our north, as a place cohabited and co-settled by humans and animals. Thank you.